just kidding. Um, Man, it's hot outside. Am I right? Thank God for AC. But it's good to be in here, in God's house, and with fellowship. Um, Title of my message is Response to Faith. And before I dive in, I just want to begin. Uh, how many of you guys work today? Anybody? Okay, good amount. That's a good amount. Pretty crazy with everything going on. I know prices are going sky high with gas. My pool guy came the other day and he's like, "Hey, just so you know, there's a nationwide shortage of chlorine." And I was like, "Okay." And he's like, "And lumber, and PVC pipe, and this." And then I was like, "Okay." It's crazy. So he's like, "Prices are going up," and it's evident with almost everything that we do. I know I had some friends looking at buying a car recently, and even the car's value. It's like we have programs and apps that we have to tell you what it's worth. Year, miles, etc. And it'll tell you exactly what the car's worth. And even now, people are paying like $10,000, $12,000 over what it's worth. Right? We have the same things for a house. You can get an appraisal, see what it's worth, the year, what's been done to it. They look at what's been renovated, and they'll appraise what it's worth. So you can get a value on almost anything you own, right? What about some things that are not so like? What about some things that are priceless? How many of you guys have pets, dogs? Okay, not a lot of you guys, but those people that are like, there's those animal people, the dog people, and some people just don't care. I saw that, yeah. I know Jordan loves my dogs, so I'm just kidding. I saw a YouTube video. It was this guy was going to random people and offering just to see. And he would open a briefcase with $100,000 cash. What would you do? You'd be surprised. Without hesitation, almost everybody said, no, no way. And they said, how much would it take? What about $1 million? No. Priceless, right? And I think the list goes from there. Things that are priceless. We have family, we have our kids. When you guys have your own kids, you'll know it's like, it's unreal what it's worth. But what about your health or your life? What would you be willing to pay? How much would you pay to save your life? Tonight I want to go over about a story about a woman in the book of Mark, and then she paid everything she had to have better health. Um, and I want to go over the story with her and her encounter with Jesus. Um, my story takes place in the book of Mark, chapter 5. Um, Mark is one of the biographies of Jesus, I'm sure you guys know. And the book of Mark is more specific to a Gentile perspective. And, there's Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. And this story is actually pretty, it's found also in Matthew, it's found also in Luke, and also in Mark. But I'm going to use the version that is in Mark. At this time, Jesus is beginning his ministry. He's performing a lot of miracles. A lot of people are coming after him. He's attracting a lot of crowds. He's performing tons of miracles, healing people, casting out demons, raising even from the dead. And I want to start with this story actually starts when Jesus is confronted by a local synagogue leader named Jairus, and he's actually on his way to help him because he came out to him to heal his daughter. And on the way there is where I want to start tonight's reading with verse 24. So Jesus went with him, it says, with him, he's talking about Jairus. And so it says this. I'm going to be reading from the NLT, so it might be a little bit different from what you guys see. I'm going to read from verse 24. Jesus went with him, and the crowd thronged behind. Thronged means I was curious, so I just looked it up. It means to fill or to be present in a place. So that place was filled with people. Jesus went with him, and the crowd thronged behind. And there was a woman in the crowd who had had a hemorrhage for 12 years. I think it says discharge of blood, yeah. Um, she had suffered a great deal from many doctors through the years and spent everything she had to pay them. But she had gotten no better. In fact, she was worse. She had heard about Jesus, so she came up behind him through the crowd and touched the fringe of his robe, for she thought to herself, if I can just touch his clothing, I will be healed. Immediately the bleeding stopped, and she could feel that she had been healed. Jesus realized once the healing power had gone from him, so he turned around to the crowd and asked, who touched my clothes? His disciples said to him, all this crowd pressing around you, how can you ask who touched me? But he kept on looking around to see who had done it. Then the frightened woman, trembling at the realization of what had happened to her, came and fell at his feet and told him what she had done. And he said to her, daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace. You have been healed. Amen. So tonight I want to go over this story. I want to take a look at this woman's situation that she was in, her struggle, and her encounter with Jesus, and see what we can learn from it. I want to look at, in a relation, sin in our life and how it affects us and what we can do about it. I don't think I need to ask if any of you guys have ever dealt with sin or, sin before, but have we handled it correctly? Wouldn't you like to get the same response from Jesus that this woman got? So I want to go on to my first point, which I want to call the problem of sin. Now let's look at this woman's situation a little bit closer. In verse 25 and 26, it says that she was suffering for 12 years from a hemorrhage. I looked up hemorrhage, and it was, just a second, it's here. An escape of blood from a ruptured blood vessel. Now, in the KJV, it calls it an issue of blood. In the ESV, it calls it a discharge of blood. NKJV calls it a flow of blood. So we're not exactly 100% what the issue was, but we knew that it was an issue with her bleeding. This situation is tough and it's hard, but I think it's a little more difficult than we understand from just this reading. You see, in this time of Jesus walking and before his sacrifice, there was a lot more Jewish law and practices going on at the time, a lot more rituals and sacrifices that we don't quite follow to this day. And it touches on this in the book of Leviticus, in the Mosaic Law, and it was, this woman was considered to be unclean by the flowing that she had of blood. Now, what this meant was she couldn't enter, the synagogue. She couldn't go to worship. She couldn't have people touch her. People couldn't touch her, or vice versa. If she sat on something, you couldn't touch that. If you did something like that, you'd be unclean for a certain amount of days. Then you'd have to go offer a sacrifice to the priest and so forth. But it kind of sucks that regardless of that, fix that you can do, she couldn't do that because she had a continual discharge of blood. So she was not very popular. She was considered an outcast, maybe, right? So she was suffering for 12 years, and not only that, but she was also outcast from probably everybody around her. Nobody wanted to deal with her, right? In the Old Testament, a lot of times, in the Newer Testament, it talks about leprosy. It was also like a metaphor of sin. They were also referred to as unclean, right? They were put outside the city. Nobody wanted to deal with them. Now, this state of unclean, a lot of times in the Bible, represents a state of sin in our life. So it talks about being unclean, right? So we see what she done incorrectly, right? In the beginning, it says she had spent everything she had, but she got no better. In fact, she was worse. How many times in our life do we have that situation where we have sin, we have issues, and we take it to everybody else that we think is the right person to take it to? Right? We take it to friends, we take it to family. Maybe there's mentors that we trust or other people that we look up to, and we try to fix it with all these different situations, right? We feel bad about it, but is this enough? No. You see, sin in our life unattended actually gets worse. Okay? There's addictions that you can develop, you know. There's pornography, there's drugs, there's alcohol. Maybe it's not something crazy like that. Maybe it's stealing or cheating or lying, something small. We think, oh, it's not a big deal. I can stop it if I want to. I don't have to continue, right? And then the next day you catch yourself right in it again. We try to do it ourselves, and in fact, we just get worse and worse in our sin, right? So I want to give this example just because it's more personal to me. You know, I was talking about your car's value. Imagine trying to fix your AC right now. Gosh, I can't imagine. But you have a situation with your car, right? And you look up the symptom, and you replace all the parts that are associated with that problem, right? And guess what? You don't fix the problem. You just throw all your money and spend money, and it gets worse and worse, right? Like, you take it to the wrong mechanic, and man, who knows what they're going to charge you. One time I got tires for my car on a Friday, and then I had an oil change on Monday, like 2 days later, and they're like, oh, you need new tires. I was like, what? So if you take it to the wrong people, they'll take your money, and your situation just gets worse. Am I right? So, yeah, sin in our life unattended gets worse, right? And we saw what this woman did incorrectly in her situation, right? She went with everybody else and paid, and it got worse and not better, right? Now I want to look at what she did correctly. I want to move on to my second point. And my second point I want to call coming to Jesus. So beginning with verse 27 is where she has her transition. And it says this: she had heard about Jesus, so she came up behind him through the crowd and touched the fringe of his robe, for she thought to herself, if I can just touch his clothing, I will be healed. Right? Now, I want to look at what this woman did differently that made Jesus notice her. Before, she was just maybe filling into the crowd, right? There was a big crowd around, and she was just like everybody else. But she did something different this time, right? She had heard about what Jesus had been doing, right? I said in the beginning, he was performing a lot of miracles. You know, there was large crowds forming around him. She heard about what Jesus was doing and who he was, right? But that's not enough. Just because we hear about Jesus doesn't heal you, doesn't save you, right? If you come to church on Sunday, Friday, Wednesday, whenever we come, is it enough to just come in here? No. But she doesn't stop there, right? So even in her uncleanly state, her shameful state that she was in, right? Maybe she had some bandages covering, you know, holding the bleeding a little bit, compressing it. Even in her shameful state, it says that she heard about Jesus, right? So she came behind him through the crowd. So even in her shameful state, she went through the crowd. I like to think of like an altar call, right? We have the altar call, and the pastor presents it and talks about it, right? And invites you to come to the front. You hear about it. Is that enough? No, it's not gonna do anything for you if you just sit there and, you know, if you don't come forward. So what does the pastor do? They invite you forward, right? It takes that step in faith, right? You have to push through the crowd. Maybe there's a lot of people here. You want to come to the front. It takes an effort, right, to push through. If Mark wants to go over to the other side of the bench, he's gonna have to push through some people and shove, right? It takes an effort to do that, right? She heard, and then she went up through the crowd to reach to Jesus, right? But she didn't even stop there, right? If you hear about Jesus, you hear about this altar call, and you come to the front of the altar, is it enough? Is that enough to just come forward? No. But she didn't stop there, right? Let's continue on. So it says she heard about Jesus. She came up through the crowd, and lastly, she touched the fringe of his robe. She reached out in faith. Regardless of her state, regardless of her sin, regardless of our sin and what we're in, we should never be shameful and fearful to come before God. He's willing to heal you. He's willing to take away your sin and to make you a child of his. I love that we sang that song tonight, right? I'm a child of God, not a fear to slave, or not a slave to fear, right? We should never be afraid to come to Jesus, right? So she heard, she came through the crowd, and she touched Jesus. We need to have that encounter with Jesus if we want to have sin in our life fixed, if we want to have healing, if we want to have XYZ. It requires more than just hearing. We need to come in faith, and we need to have an encounter with Jesus. Um, After this, something happened that I always like this story. I've always heard it, and I don't know. I really admire this woman, and I always admired the response that she got from Jesus. Like, what an honor, right? Could you imagine? Out of everybody there, he's like, "Hey, who touched me?" So my last point I want to say is Jesus' response. Why do you think Jesus asked who touched him? You guys ever think about that? I always thought it was funny. Like, he is God. He knows everything about you. Why do you think he asked, who touched me? Did he not know? Even his disciples were like, what are you talking about? There's a ton of people here. Only she knew and only Jesus knew what had happened, right? She felt healed, and Jesus felt a healing power from him. In verse 33, it says, Then the frightened woman, trembling at the realization of what had happened, came and fell at his feet and told him what she had done. She was frightened and she was trembling. Now, you guys, let's remember what kind of state that she was in, right? She was unclean. And if anybody dealt with her or she dealt with anybody and physically, that would continue on to the next person, right? She just touched, you remember, Jesus was a holy man at this time, right? He was abiding by every Jewish law at this time. And in Matthew 5:17 it says, Do not think I came to abolish the law or the prophets. I have come not to abolish them, but to fulfill them, right? He was the gold standard at that time, and even to this point, he is the gold standard, but even to the Jewish law. And so she knew that he might not respond in a nice way. You know, she was fearful. But how nice is it that Jesus responds by saying, daughter, calls her a child, daughter. Your faith has made you well, right? Again, that's why that song was perfect. I'm a child of God, not a slave to fear. We should never be ashamed to come him regardless of our state that we're in. Jesus is waiting for all of us to come to him honestly and faithfully. And when we do, he will be delighted. Another thing I want to touch on is when he called her out was also, I think, another test of her faith, right? She said, if I just touch his robe, I'll be healed. But then he asked, who touched me? And you think, why? Just like how this woman heard, about what he was doing, what he was healing, Jesus wanted to make a testament out of her, out of her situation. He wanted everybody to know that she was healed. So he called her out to see if she'd respond, and she did, which is good. In Revelations 12:11, it says, we will overcome by the blood of the Lamb and the word of our testimony. So when we come before God and he works in our life, he changes us, he takes away our sin, we need to be a testimony for others around us, right? We need to be an example for others around us. And I think it's the most powerful thing when you hear about what he can do. I think most of us, there's that example. How many of you have came to Jesus because of a family member? And almost everybody raises their hand, right? It's very important and very powerful to be an example to everybody around you. In conclusion, Jesus was always moved by people with great faith in the New Testament. I know there's a story also with the Roman officer, right? There's this story in all three books, and there's other examples. He's waiting for all of us to come out in faith before him, right? Whether it be for sin, maybe it's something in your life that you're struggling with, maybe it's you're waiting to do something for God, right? Step out in faith, because when you do, God's going to be there for you, and he's going to be there with you regardless of your situation. So I want to just recap over my 3 points and this woman's situation, right? She had an issue. She had an unclean state, right? Many times we do have sin in our life, right? But she had given everything incorrectly, right? A lot of times we do that. We go to friends, we go to family, we go to XYZ, and we try to fix the situation ourselves. It doesn't work. There's only one way, right? And let's remember not to just hear about Jesus, but to step in faith and to encounter Jesus, right? Let's just not hear about it, but step out in faith. When we do so, He will make us clean and He will make us His children, as we sang this evening. I want to invite you guys to stand. And in conclusion, I want to have a prayer. And I want to pray that in the future we don't just hear about X, Y, or Z, right? We don't come to church and just hear, but we are people that do physically, we actually step out in faith and do something real. So I want to keep this in mind in our next prayer. And in closing, I want to invite Miriam to pray for us. And let's all encourage her in prayer, and let's pray together.